Hi, thanks again for joining me today. Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. Do you think there's anything more to us than just meat all the way down? In other words, are our brains it when it comes to what we are? Are we just a bunch of firing synapses in our heads? Do we have free will? Do we have a soul? And if we do, what is it? So Dr. Sharon Dirckx, Dirckx, she's a brain scientist. And she has this book. It's not very long. It's maybe, 120, 130 pages. But it's really interesting. Now, she's a brain scientist, and so she's got some interesting stories. I'm going to start with one of her stories here. I'm going to this is about the third podcast I've done on this book. I did one about the views of consciousness that are out there and a chapter on free will, in case you find that interesting. I'm doing chapter 4 today. Are we more than machines? So she starts with a story. So I'd like to tell you that story. It's, a little over a page and a half. I think it's worth it, so stay with me here. Remember, she's a brain scientist. So she says, I peered into Amy's eyes. All I saw was emptiness. That same deep well of emptiness that I had seen countless times before, and people who, like Amy, were thought to be awake but unaware. Amy gave nothing back. She yawned. A big, open-mouthed yawn followed by an almost mournful sigh as her head collapsed back onto the pillow. Now, she was a college varsity basketball player. Now, she'd left a bar late one night with a group of friends. I'm shortening this part. And a boyfriend that was angry at her, an ex-boyfriend, shoved her. She fell over and slammed her head on a concrete curb. And it wasn't good at all. It said a bunch of blood vessels tore loose, shock waves lacerated and bruised critical regions far from the point of impact. So what's she left with now? Let me go back to the story. Now, Amy had a feeding tube surgically inserted into her stomach that supplied her with essential fluids and nutrients. A catheter drained her urine. She had no control over her bowels, and she was in diapers. 2 male doctors breezed into the room. "What do you think?" said the more senior of the two, looking straight at me. "I won't know unless we do the scans," I replied. "Well, I'm not a betting man, but I'd say she's in a vegetative state." He was upbeat, almost jovial. I didn't respond. The 2 doctors turned to Amy's parents, who had been patiently sitting while I observed her. They were clearly exhausted. The wife gripped the husband's hand as the doctors explained. Amy didn't understand speech. She didn't have memories. She had no thoughts or feelings. She couldn't feel pleasure or pain. They gently reminded Bill and Agnes, that's the husband and wife, that she would need round-the-clock care for as long as she lived. In the absence of an advance directive stating otherwise, shouldn't they consider taking Amy off life support and allowing her to die? After all, isn't that what she would have wanted? Well, Amy's parents weren't ready to take that step, Dirckx reports, and they signed a consent form to allow me, that's the doctor, Dirckx, to put her in an fMRI scanner. I don't know what an fMRI scanner is. Anyway, and to search for signs of some part of the Amy that they loved to see if she was still there. 5 days later, I walked back into Amy's room where I found Bill and Agnes by her bedside. They looked up at me expectantly. I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and gave them the news that they hadn't allowed themselves to hope for. The scans have shown us that Amy is not in a vegetative state after all. In fact, she's aware of everything. So after 5 days of intensive investigation, they found that Amy was far more than just alive. She was entirely conscious. She had heard every conversation, recognized every visitor, and listened intently to every decision being made on her behalf. Yet she had been unable to move a muscle to tell the world, "I'm still here. I'm not dead yet." Isn't that something? Isn't that a powerful story? Oh my goodness, I just try to imagine, what if that was me in that kind of state, and I'm wanting to call out, I'm alive, I'm in here, recognize me. So she says, she continues now, she's finished with the story. She says there's a professor, Adrian Owen. He spent 20 years studying patients who have brain trauma, and he has a book called Into the Gray Zone, and he tells the story of several of his patients, including Amy. And for Owen, he's a clinician. He has a huge question. Is there any possibility that a patient who appears to be vegetative is, in fact, conscious? So his team, Owen's team at the University of Cambridge, discovered the answer to the question was yes. And they published these results in the prestigious journal Science in 2006. So they called it, I guess, locked-in syndrome. And they said that was not a new concept. There was a movie in the 90s called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And I read that, by the way. That was really powerful. Same thing. The guy recovered, but he was in that same, at least what appeared to be a vegetative state, but he wasn't. He knew what was going on. And that book is the story of Jean-Dominique Bauby and the road that he and his loved ones walked in the aftermath of his massive stroke. So neurologists since then have figured out ways to test whether or not a person is awake. They can get them to answer questions like maybe small eye movements. And so Owen's team even took it one stage further and developed ways where an entirely immobile patient could respond with their mind. Well, I'd like to have found out what they did, but she goes on. So I found that really fascinating. And so scientists have discovered that a small number of patients that are considered vegetative actually could follow instructions and answer questions about themselves using mental exercises. They were conscious. So she said, well, what are we going to make of these discoveries? I mean, today, what are we hearing from some scientists? They nod and they tell us, no, you're just your brain. That's all you are, right? There's no external part of you besides just the physical. Nothing supernatural, nothing soulish, no will. You just your brain, just a bunch of chemicals and neurons firing. So she says, well, Owen's study is just one of signposts that show neuroscience itself is indicating human consciousness goes beyond, it surpasses the condition of our brains. Are we more than our brains and just physical machines? Well, here's what Owen himself said. This is his summary of his research. And again, this is a quote that I think is worth sharing with you. So this is coming from Owen, who did all that work. We have discovered that 15 to 20% of people in the vegetative state who are assumed to have no more awareness than a head of broccoli are fully conscious, although they never respond to any form of external stimulation. They may open their eyes, grunt and groan, occasionally uttering isolated words. Like zombies, they appear to live entirely in their own world, devoid of thoughts or feelings. Many really are as oblivious and incapable of thought as their doctors believe, but a sizable number are experiencing something quite different. Intact minds adrift deep within damaged bodies and brains. And that's the part I underlined in his quotation there. There are intact minds. You notice he doesn't say it's the brain. He calls it a mind that's adrift within a damaged brain. There are two parts there, right? There's the physical part you can measure, and then there's something else, the invisible part, as called a mind. So for the rest of this chapter, which I hope we can get to today, but if not, we'll do it a second podcast on this. But she's now going to consider, this is the heart of this chapter, there's the view that the brain generates consciousness. In other words, it's just a matter of the brain doing whatever the brain does and tricking us into thinking we're conscious. Then there's a second idea that consciousness actually resides in everything that's in the world. Everything. And then there's the third idea that consciousness is beyond the brain. That would be probably the Christian perspective. So let's take a look. Here's the first view. The brain generates consciousness. She tells another famous story. Phineas Gage, he was a railway worker back in Vermont in the 19th century, and they had to, he was clearing rocks. So they drill a hole and they'd shove dynamite in them with a metal rod and then light the fuse and run like crazy. Well, in 1848, he was 25 years old, and he was using that rod to smash down the dynamite, and it created a spark. Boom! The dynamite exploded, and that rod shot through his skull and brain and landed about 90 feet away, and it destroyed much of his left frontal lobe. They thought he was dead, but he regained consciousness and went on to live for another 12 years. But what's interesting is he underwent a dramatic personality change. He had been very mild-mannered, but he became prone to profanity and inappropriate behavior, finally lost his job. And so she says the medical literature today has all sorts of reports like this, personal injuries that people have had, brain injuries, and it's changed them. And she says you see that with people like those who are dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia. So she says, what's going on here? It looks like damage to the brain has a profound effect on the mind. Okay, so can you see where she's going with this and where some people are going? Whenever the brain gets damaged or injured, the mind similarly suffers. So obviously, she says, the mind and the brain, that's consciousness and brain, they're not identical, but they seem to be clearly connected. Well, many agnostics, she says, and atheists, and even some Christians, say, well, what's going on here is that the brain generates mind and consciousness. Okay, that's called non-reductive physicalism, fancy term. She said, think about a university. It's an institution, has a lot of different departments, and the university arises out of the fact that these different departments are generating research, but the university is more than just the sum of its departments. It has an alumni network, maybe a donor base, and things like that. So the institution is formed by all these component parts, but it's greater than all of them combined. But if you took those departments and took them away, the university would cease to exist. So here's the feeling. The conclusion, according to this view, mind and consciousness somehow merge together, right, through the coming together of a number of physical parts, but it's more than the brain alone. So she says, well, what are we going to make of this view? She says, the question, of course, comes out is, how did consciousness emerge, right? If we're in a universe of just meaningless matter and non-conscious neurons, how did they come to generate conscious minds? And she says, that's a hard problem, and it hasn't gone away. And she says, if the only basic ingredient you need to get consciousness is a physical brain, why don't animals have access to that same level of consciousness as humans? I mean, think about humans and chimps. They share a lot of DNA. Primates, she says, seem to have some conscious awareness, but they don't seem to have anywhere near the same extent that humans do. She said, take a dog. Said they obviously are aware of their environment. They get scared in thunderstorms, and they whine when the owner is out. Sometimes they have emotions. If they're fearful, they might have their tail between their legs. She said, but as far as we can tell, they don't appear to have an inner life. They don't crawl into their bed thinking, whew, I had a difficult day today. They don't ask themselves, why am I a dog and not a cat? Or what's the purpose of my life? She says Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, and he's a well-known individual, I've read some of his material, he argues that primates can be trained to use language and to do cognitive tasks in a limited way. Well, that's true, she says, but only if a human initiates the training. I think that's interesting. So she said, she quotes from Max Tegmark. He wrote in a New Scientist book called The Universe Next Door, and he says it's just complexity. Just when you get a group of atoms and you arrange them in a new way, you get new properties. And the higher and higher the level of complexity, you end up with more sophisticated abilities. Well, she says, but studies show that even the most developed and the most highly trained primate can't do what a 4-year-old can do in cognitive ability. There seems to be a huge discontinuity between apes and humans. Complexity alone doesn't get us there. She says, what if the brain dies? So here's an example dealing with what are called NDEs. These are near-death experiences. She uses another study here, a story. In 1991, Pamela Reynolds had a severe brain hemorrhage caused by an aneurysm. She had to have surgery. They needed her body temperature to be cooled for that surgery and for her heart and her brain signal to be flatlined and to drain the blood from her head. Wow. So she's clinically dead. So the operation was successful, and then when they brought her around, she recalled being conscious during the surgery, but she was flatlined, right? She had no heart or brain signal, and the blood was out of her head. Cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabom recounts that story in his book called Light and Death. So he looks at NDEs, near-death experiences, and there are more and more stories like this. Hundreds of people have described suddenly being out of their body, looking down on the room, visions of white tunnels, deceased relatives, a feeling of peacefulness and well-being, and actually some have described pretty horrifying NDEs. They did a Gallup survey, I guess, in 1982, she reports, talking about millions of people. They revealed 15% have had an NDE. And including this, we've had lately some cardiologists, psychologists, and pediatricians. And books have been written by distinguished surgeons and scientists. So NDEs are an objection that the idea that the brain generates consciousness. I mean, after all, if consciousness is dependent on the brain, then when the brain dies, wouldn't we expect consciousness to cease? But NDEs seem to be saying you can be conscious without a functioning brain. Now, I've read a lot on NDEs, and there's some amazing stories. I'll just share one, but there are a lot of them. A person was taken in for surgery, recovered, went back to their room, and said during the surgery they left their body, went up to the roof, and they found a pair of sneakers on the roof. Nobody could see it from down below. So somebody was curious enough later to go up on the roof and take a look, and sure enough, the exact style and color of the sneakers was there. So there are a lot of stories like that where it looks like people are somehow able to do things even beyond their body. Well, some people say, yeah, but these NDEs could be fabricated, or maybe it's residual brain activity. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. And she said, okay, you can't rule that out. But she says some patients have recounted details from their near-death state that could be externally corroborated, like I told you. Then there's a story of, for example, a blind person, blind since birth, and describe family and friends. Wow. They describe conversations that took place at the time of surgery, but not in the surgical room, several rooms away. And she said, okay, maybe it could be residual brain activity. We couldn't rule that out, but the patient is in a state of clinical death. That blood supply to their heart and brain has been temporarily ceased so they could do the surgery. So it seems like that's awfully hard to talk about residual brain signal. Any wishful thinking by those who are scared to die doesn't seem to explain NDEs either. If the person is clinically dead, then their fears of dying are irrelevant. And actually, some NDEs are scary, right? Okay, so do NDEs call into question, she says, the view that consciousness is dependent on the brain? Some say yes. No, she's not willing to just stake her position completely on that. But she says NDEs may seem bizarre and contrary to ordinary experience. She said, even if you just had one authentic encounter, just one, that's a serious blow to the idea that consciousness resides entirely in or even emerges from the physical brain. Then what I like that she's willing to talk about here is, are NDEs proof that heaven is real? Because you've got some people telling stories about going to heaven. She says Christians, though, should be pretty hesitant to say NDEs prove God. So I would agree with her there. What about the second issue, right? So the first was the idea, well, maybe the first story is the brain can generate consciousness, right? Just you get enough material stuff together and enough neurons firing that they will produce consciousness out of non-material things. Well, that seems hard to believe. What's the second issue that people will say, well, maybe consciousness resides in everything? That seems really strange to me. I'll just tell you that. So there's a Professor David Chalmers, and he said that there's only one kind of substance in the whole universe, just one kind, but it's both physical and conscious in nature. So everything is conscious to some extent. All particles, we're talking atoms, molecules, on up. All particles, she says, in this view, have physical and conscious dimensions. Conscious states are present in every atom, even inanimate things like minerals and metal and mold. That's called panpsychism. Now, she said that underlies Buddhist and Jainist thinking from the East. She said, but that's pretty difficult to visualize in real terms. Boy, no kidding. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at my laptop right now. It's conscious? So back to Dirckx here. She said, is it true that electrons, rocks, and trees have some degree of consciousness? But what does that mean in practice? She said, you can't verify that. But she says it's popular today among philosophers because it solves that enigma of consciousness. It says, well, everything's conscious to some extent. Somebody who also seems to like that idea is Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy. He's a little bit different than Chalmers. He believes atoms and molecules are what he calls precursors to consciousness. And that's got a fancy name too, proto-panpsychism. So an electron has a different experience of the world than a human, but the potential for consciousness exists. But I I think this is good. They said there are a lot of critics. They said that doesn't really solve the problem. What does that mean to be pre-conscious? And she quotes a philosopher, William Jaworski. We know what beliefs or desires are, but what are proto-beliefs and proto-desires? I believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4, for instance, but what would it mean to have a proto-belief that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. Here's the third issue. Let's see, how much more do I have? I don't know if I want to cover it. Okay, this one may run a little long. You okay with that? Here's the third view. So first was the brain can develop consciousness on its own. Second is that consciousness is just a part of the universe. Third is, maybe, is consciousness beyond the brain? In other words, there's conscious states that are independent of neurons and brain chemistry. There's a physical brain, but there's a non-physical mind. That's called substance dualism. And that's pretty popular. Several good thinkers are substance dualists. Richard Swinburne, Keith Ward at University of Oxford, Alvin Plantinga at Notre Dame, J.P. Moreland at Biola. Here's a professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University in New York, Michael Egner. He said many of his patients are missing large parts of their brains, but they have good minds. So he said a person can remain intact despite all sorts of damage to the brain. He's worked 30 years in the field. Now, Egner's concluded that the mind of a person is beyond simply the workings of their brain. So he says, and this is this doctor, materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. Yet, evidence from the laboratory, operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. Yeah, I think that's really good. She talks about patients that have dementia, have moments of lucidity. So she says even the story of Phineas Gage, right? People say, oh, see, the mind is just dependent on the brain. But remember him, the one that had that iron rod go through his mind? He ended up working again, right? So, yeah, he says he was a little upset. But said even with the most severe damage to the brain, he continued to function. So she said, how does the brain and the mind interact? If mind and brain are distinct, how do we explain that there's some kind of interaction? Well, she says many dualists, substance dualists today, think that the conscious states exist beyond the brain, but they are causally connected to the brain. And she says, for example, the non-physical can change the physical in a lot of ways. I mean, think about a kid that gets bullied at school. What's going to happen? It's going to change that kid's physical abilities in a way, maybe losing appetite or losing sleep, having panic attacks. Says crying, right? That could be triggered by the news that a loved one has died or a person has passed their exams. That's non-physical. That information is non-physical, but has a physical effect. So she says the immaterial impacts the material in daily life. So why not a non-physical mind interacting with a physical brain? She says some people dismiss this. Oh, it's not scientific. But she said there's a scientist, well-known scientist, who's changed his mind. He's a Harvard biologist professor, George Wald. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He began life as a staunch atheist. But in his 70s, he changed his mind. Here's what he has to say about consciousness. Consciousness seems to me to be wholly impervious to science. It doesn't lie as an indigestible element within science. It's just the opposite. It's a highly digestible element within consciousness. Mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source, the condition of physical reality. So he says that's the stuff of which physical reality is composed. It's mind stuff. She says, well, the nature of consciousness, you can't really, on the basis of science, come to a conclusion. It kind of depends on a worldview. If God exists, right, if God exists, then you could consider consciousness to be fundamental to the universe. So Christians believe there was a conscious mind, God, who brought about human beings with consciousness. She says, look at Genesis 2. It says, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Said, that seems to imply physical descriptions alone don't describe the human person. So that Hebrew word for breath of life is neshama or ruach, and means God's breath or God's spirit. So according to these verses, a person is way more than matter, more than a machine. We're made in the image of God. If God himself is conscious, well, we might expect humans to be conscious as well. So that's substance dualism, and that's where she lands. And she says that's a good chance that that's the case, if there's a God. And then she quotes J.P. Moreland, and I'll wrap up at this point. We all know you can't really pull a rabbit out of a hat. When a magician claims to pull a rabbit out of the hat, we know there has to be a rabbit in the hat to begin with. You can't get something out of nothing. Moreland continues, you can't have nothing there and then all of a sudden a rabbit appears. If you start with matter from the Big Bang and all you do is rearrange it, according to chemistry and physics, you're not going to be able to get a conscious rabbit out of that material hat. You'll end up with a very complicated hat, but there'll be no rabbit. The reason consciousness exists is because we started with a rabbit, a great big rabbit, namely God, who is himself conscious, and we don't have to pull a rabbit out of an empty hat and explain how you get consciousness from matter, because there was never such a thing as just pure matter. God always existed. So she says consciousness exists because God exists. So I'll end the chapter on that. I think that's fascinating. I hope you find it as well. A book, again, is called Am I Just My Brain? Much to think about here. And we're being challenged these days as Christians that everything is physical, right? You can describe everything in physical terms. Well, consciousness is actually a problem for the physicalist. And I've seen books talk about the hard problem of consciousness. So they're struggling with it, but Christians don't. We know there's a God. We know he's a conscious agent, and he has given us consciousness as well, a mind, a spirit, whatever you want to call it. Well, thanks so much for being part of this podcast today. I hope everything's going well for you. Talk to you later.